There are empires that fall to armies, and there are empires that fall to weather. The Viking Age in Britain ended not with a sword, but with a storm. In October 1263, 200 longships carrying 20,000 Norse warriors sailed into Scottish waters. They were the largest Viking invasion fleet ever assembled. Behind them stood 500 years of Norse dominance over the islands and coastlines of northern Britain. Ahead of them stood a 22-year-old Scottish king who had been waiting for exactly this moment, not with an army massed on the shore, not with a fleet of warships blocking the channel, with a calendar. Alexander III of Scotland had spent weeks stalling diplomatic negotiations with the Norwegian king, delaying and deferring with a patience that drove the Norse delegation to fury. He consulted advisors. He prayed in churches. He reconsidered terms with maddening thoroughness. Every courtesy that required just one more day served a single purpose. He was waiting for October, because October in the Firth of Clyde meant storms, and storms, Alexander understood, were more lethal than any army he could assemble. In 4 days, the weather would destroy what 5 centuries of Scottish warfare could not. The greatest Viking fleet ever launched would be shattered not by Scottish steel, but by Scottish rain. And the last great Viking king would die in a borrowed bed, whispering to his son about wind. For 500 years, Norse longships had haunted Scottish waters like wolves of the sea. From the Hebrides to the Isle of Man, from Orkney to the coast of Caithness, Viking jarls ruled island kingdoms that answered to Norway, not Scotland. These were not raiders anymore. They had not been raiders for generations. They were embedded rulers whose dragon ships were as common as fishing boats in western Scottish waters. Norse language, Norse law, Norse culture had taken root so deeply in the islands that the Hebrides were more Scandinavian than Scottish. Place names told the story. Kirkwall was Norse. Stornoway was Norse. The language spoken in fishing villages along the western coast was a blend of Gaelic and Old Norse that neither Edinburgh nor Bergen fully understood. Churches that had once been plundered by Viking raiders now bore Norse carvings above their doors. The conquerors had become neighbors. The raiders had become landlords. And the landlords had lived there so long that evicting them seemed as impossible as moving the mountains behind the shore. The Western Isles were not just territories. They were the maritime highway of the North Atlantic. Control them, and you controlled trade, warfare, and communication between Scandinavia and the British Isles. Every ship sailing between Norway, Iceland, Ireland, and the growing kingdoms of Britain passed through waters that Norse jarls taxed and Norse warriors patrolled. For Norway, losing the islands meant losing their last foothold in Britain, the western anchor of a maritime empire that had once stretched from Greenland to Constantinople. For Scotland, gaining them meant security from the sea raids that had plagued 20 generations of coastal Scots. Mothers who told children to watch the horizon, farmers who built their houses out of sight of the shore, priests who hid church silver when autumn winds began to blow. The power dynamics were shifting beneath the surface like tectonic plates. Scotland was growing stronger with every decade. A series of capable kings had consolidated royal authority, built stone castles where wooden halls had stood, and slowly welded the fractious Highland clans into something approaching a unified kingdom. The Scottish Church, answering to Rome rather than Scandinavia, gave the crown an administrative reach that Norse island governors could not match. Norway, meanwhile, was stretched thin, its attention divided between Scandinavian politics, trading interests in the Baltic, and the increasingly expensive business of maintaining distant island colonies whose loyalty was no longer guaranteed. The question was not whether conflict would come, it was when, and who would choose the timing. The man who chose the timing was barely old enough to grow a full beard. Alexander III was 22 years old in the autumn of 1263. He had been king since childhood, surviving regencies, factional politics, and the constant threat of Norse raids that treated his western coastline as a buffet. Other kings in his position might have charged into battle, seeking the kind of glory that medieval chronicles celebrated. Alexander played a longer game. He understood something his predecessors had not. The Norse Empire in Scotland was held together by fear and tradition, not by strength. The Jarls who ruled the islands were not the warriors their grandfathers had been. Their loyalties were divided. Their connection to Norway was fraying with every generation that married local women, spoke Gaelic at home, and attended Scottish churches. The empire was hollow. It needed only the right push at the right moment to collapse entirely. Alexander's diplomatic strategy was a masterpiece of calculated provocation. He offered to purchase the Hebrides from Norway. The offer itself was an insult of the highest order. It implied that Norse sovereignty, maintained by blood and iron for 5 centuries, was a commodity that could be bought at market price like a herd of cattle. Norse chronicles called the proposal outrageous, a dishonor to the memory of every jarl who had ever raised a longship's sail. That was exactly the reaction Alexander wanted. An angry king makes mistakes. A proud king cannot retreat. And an old, proud, angry king with a disease he is hiding from his own court will sail into a trap rather than admit he is too weak to spring it. Alexander wanted Hakon angry. He wanted him to sail south with every ship Norway could muster. And he wanted that fleet to arrive in Scottish waters in October, when the Firth of Clyde became a graveyard for any vessel caught without shelter. The provocation worked exactly as designed. Facing Alexander across the North Sea was Hakon IV of Norway. Called the Old at 59, he was a man whose entire identity was built on strength. He had ruled for 46 years. He had survived civil wars that killed 3 rival claimants to the Norwegian throne. He had crushed internal rebellions with a decisiveness that earned him the fear of every jarl in Scandinavia. He had expanded Norwegian influence to its greatest extent, maintaining an empire of islands and trading posts that stretched from the Arctic Circle to the Irish Sea. But age was catching up with the warrior in ways that no amount of will could conceal. Illness plagued him, though he hid it from his court and his commanders with the discipline of a man who knew that a sick king was a dead king in Norse politics. Viking kings did not show weakness. Weakness invited challenge. Challenge invited the kind of bloody succession crisis that Hakon had spent 46 years preventing. His body was failing. His pride was not. This campaign would be his last chance to preserve Norse Scotland for his dynasty. His last chance to remind the world that Norwegian kings did not sell their territory to Scottish boys. The island lords caught between these 2 monarchs found themselves in an impossible position. Men like Magnus of Man, whose fathers had been Norse kings but whose futures clearly lay with Scotland. Men whose blood was half Norse and half Gaelic, whose loyalty shifted with every rumor of fleet movements and diplomatic ultimatums. They watched the horizon and waited to see which king would blink first. Neither blinked, both moved. The great hall at Bergen thundered with war cries as Hakon assembled the largest Norse fleet in living memory. 200 longships. Stretch that number across your imagination. Masts rising from the water like a forest. Dragon heads carved at every prow, painted eyes staring south toward Scotland. Between 12,000 and 20,000 warriors answered the call, more fighting men than most medieval cities contained within their walls. This was not just a fleet, it was the concentrated military power of Norse civilization, loaded onto wood and canvas, and aimed at a coastline that had feared it for 5 centuries. Jarls brought their best warriors, champions who had raided from Iceland to the Mediterranean. Ships carried not just fighters, but the tools of permanent conquest. Craftsmen, supplies for fortification, everything needed to reassert Norse dominance in the islands forever. Ogmund Crouchdance sailed with them, the berserker whose name alone sent lesser men running. He was the kind of warrior the sagas were written about. A man who fought with a fury that went beyond courage into something older and darker. A battle madness that made him impervious to pain and indifferent to death. He would lead the shore party when the time came, the human spearhead of an invasion that was supposed to restore Norse glory. Warriors competed to serve in his band, seeing honor in fighting, beside a legend whose reputation had been earned in blood from the Baltic to the Irish Sea. None of them knew they were volunteering for their doom. Against this armada, Alexander positioned something far more dangerous than a conventional army. He deployed patience. The Scots deliberately kept their numbers vague, their positions hidden. Mobile cavalry units under Alexander of Dundonald lurked in valleys behind the coast, ready to strike and vanish. Small garrisons watched the shore from fortified positions. Beacon fires were prepared on every headland, ready to spread the alarm the moment Norse sails appeared. But the real weapon was not mounted knights or archers or signal fires. It was the calendar. When Haakon's vast fleet arrived at the Firth of Clyde for negotiations in late September, Alexander played for time with the skill of a man whose entire kingdom depended on his ability to waste other people's days. Every delay was calculated to the hour. He sent negotiators who had authority to discuss but not to decide, raised objections that required consultation with advisors who happened to be traveling, and proposed meeting locations that somehow always had problems requiring further discussion. The Norse delegation grew increasingly frustrated with a process designed to accomplish nothing. That was the entire point. While Haakon counted ships and paced the deck of his flagship demanding action, Alexander was counting days until the October storms that every Scottish sailor knew were coming as surely as the tide. The weather patterns of October in the Firth of Clyde were written in centuries of dead sailors. Any mariner who had survived a decade in those waters knew that after September, the North Atlantic turned murderous. Storms swept in from the northwest without warning, winds that could snap masts like dry sticks, waves that could swallow longships whole and leave nothing but splinters on the morning tide. Haakon anchored his fleet at the Cumbres, islands in the Firth that offered shelter from normal weather. The anchorage looked perfect, protected waters, good sightlines, room for 200 ships. But locals knew what Haakon did not. When storms came from the northwest, which they did every October with the reliability of a church bell, the surrounding islands and narrow channels turned the anchorage from shelter into a ship graveyard. The very features that made it seem safe would trap the fleet when the weather turned. Haakon either did not know or did not care. Pride demanded he maintain position, maintain pressure, show the Scottish boy that Norse kings do not retreat from rain. That pride would kill thousands. September 30th, 1263, dawned gray and ominous. Experienced Norse sailors felt it in their bones. Pressure dropping, wind shifting to the northwest. That electric tension in the air that precedes nature's worst. Some captains quietly suggested withdrawal to open water, where the fleet could ride out whatever was coming. Haakon refused. Retreat now meant admitting defeat without drawing a sword. A Norse king does not run from weather. Then physics became Scotland's greatest ally. The storm struck like a giant's fist. Winds shrieked through the rigging at speeds that turned rain horizontal, each drop a tiny spear stinging exposed skin. Longships, masterpieces of naval engineering, designed to ride ocean swells with grace, found themselves trapped between islands as waves rose higher than their carved dragon heads. The physics did not care about Viking courage or Norse tradition. It cared about wind speed, wave height, and the tensile strength of iron anchor chains. And the chains began to snap. Within hours, the organized fleet became chaos. Ships dragged anchors, iron links parting under impossible strain. Vessels crashed into each other, oak hulls that had sailed from Bergen to the Hebrides splintering like kindling. Proud dragon heads disappeared beneath foam. The master sailors of the Norse world, men who had navigated from Greenland to Russia, could not hold position against a force that no seamanship could counter. Commands disappeared in wind that sounded like the world ending. The desperate beaching began near Largs as the storm entered its second hour. Ship crews faced an impossible choice that played out in real time across 200 vessels simultaneously. Stay aboard a ship that was being pounded to kindling by waves and wind, or leap into freezing water in full armor and swim for a beach controlled by an enemy who had been waiting for exactly this moment. One by one, then in clusters, then in a desperate mass, longships drove toward the shore. Captains chose the enemy they could see over the demon of the deep. Some made it, many did not. The first Norse casualties came not from Scottish steel, but from Scottish seas. Men drowned trying to swim ashore in full chainmail. The armor that had saved their lives in 100 boarding actions and shield wall clashes now pulled them under the surface of the Firth of Clyde, as surely as if stones had been tied to their ankles. Others were crushed between ships that the waves ground together like millstones. Oak hulls designed to flex in ocean swells, now splintering against each other in the confined waters between the islands. Bodies washed up with the wreckage, the storm claiming Vikings with the impersonal efficiency of a machine that does not distinguish between heroes and ordinary men. The beach at Largs in the gray October dawn was carpeted with splintered wood, torn sailcloth, and the bodies of men who had conquered from Iceland to Constantinople but could not conquer the weather of the Firth of Clyde. The longships that had made Europe tremble were kindling now. The warriors who had made kings pay tribute were corpses rolling in the surf. Despite the continuing storm on October 1st, Håkon ordered reinforcements for the beached crews. Small boats fought through hell to land more warriors on the hostile shore. Between 200 and 1,000 men, exact numbers lost in the chaos, scrambled onto a beach they did not know, in a country that wanted them dead. Ogmund Crouchdance led them, the berserker whose presence was supposed to rally the demoralized and terrify the enemy. The trap revealed itself with terrible clarity. As the Norse struggled to organize on the soaking beach, movement flickered on the hills above. The Scots had been there all along, watching, waiting. Like wolves sensing wounded prey, they began to descend. This was not how Vikings fought, not in any saga or tradition stretching back to the first longship that crossed the North Sea. Vikings fought in shield walls on firm ground, where the man beside you protected your flank and the enemy stood close enough to smell. This was chaos. Groups of exhausted, waterlogged men who had spent the night fighting the sea, now facing fresh enemies who had spent that same night sleeping in dry shelters, eating hot food, and sharpening weapons they would use in the morning. The initial skirmish told the tale of the entire battle. Scattered Norse groups, waterlogged and disoriented, faced Scottish cavalry appearing from mist and rain on fresh horses. Arrows fell from positions the Vikings could not even see. Scottish soldiers rolled stones down the slopes above the beach, using the landscape itself as a weapon the way a man uses a hill to push a boulder. The master sailors of the North Atlantic were now infantry on hostile ground. Every attempt to form ranks failed. The beach was too narrow and the ground too treacherous. Wet sand sucked at boots. Seaweed made footing impossible. Chainmail, salvation in organized battle where a man stands firm and meets the enemy chest to chest, became a death sentence for men trying to maneuver across slippery stones. Some Norse threw away their shields just to move faster. Others stripped off their mail coats entirely, preferring to fight unarmored than to drown in iron on a beach. These were men whose grandfathers had worn that same mail into the gates of Constantinople. Now, it was killing them on a beach in Scotland. It was not enough. Every hour the Norse spent reorganizing, more Scots appeared on the hillsides. Fresh troops replacing tired ones. Cavalry rotating with infantry. A steady, deliberate escalation that never gave the Norse a moment to catch their breath. The hill fight showed Norse courage against impossible odds. A group of Vikings gained high ground briefly, making the Scots pay for every foot with blood and iron. Ogmund Crouchdance was at the center of it. The berserker planted his feet in the mud and roared challenges that carried over the wind. 20, then 30 men rallied to him, forming a desperate circle of shields and axes. For minutes that felt like hours, this knot of Norse fury held back Scottish charges. Ogmund's axe carved arcs of death around him, the battle madness keeping him upright and fighting when exhaustion and wounds should have dropped him. But then came the moment that broke the Norse spirit. Scottish arrows found the gaps. One by one, the circle shrank. Ogmund took wound after wound, each one that would have killed an ordinary man, simply adding to the berserker's rage. 13 wounds in total. His shield was split. His axe handle was slick with blood that was not entirely his own. He was still singing, still roaring in Old Norse, when the last arrow struck him through the throat and his voice finally stopped. His body, recovered later under truce, told the entire story of the Battle of Largs, written in scar tissue and broken iron. The Scots who killed him reportedly stood over his body in silence for a moment before moving on. Even enemies recognized what they had just destroyed. If Crouchdance could fall, what hope remained for mortal men? The answer was none, and the Norse knew it. Dawn on October 2nd brought the cruelest blow. Norse honor demanded they return for their dead. Vikings did not leave fallen warriors for ravens and strangers. This cultural imperative, this refusal to abandon the bodies of comrades, drew burial parties back onto the beach. The Scots were waiting. They came from every direction. Cavalry from the north, infantry from the hills, archers from positions prepared during the night. This was no longer a battle. It was systematic destruction. Running fights turned Largs Beach into a slaughterhouse. Norse rear guards fought desperate rearguard actions, buying time for comrades to reach boats that might or might not still be floating. Scottish cavalry charged through scattered groups, lances finding gaps in disrupted formations. Individual combats erupted across the beach. No lines, no order, just men killing each other in the rain, while the surf washed blood into the Firth of Clyde. The Scots did not need to win every fight. They only needed to prevent the Norse from organizing. And the rain and the mud and the exhaustion and the arrows did the rest. October 3rd brought the image that would haunt Norse memory for generations. Commanders, seeing the futility of rescue, ordered their own damaged ships burned, rather than let them fall into Scottish hands. Longships set ablaze by their own crews. The smoke columns rising from Largs Beach looked like funeral pyres for 5 centuries of conquest, because that is exactly what they were. Funeral pyres for an age that had begun with Lindisfarne and ended on a Scottish beach in the rain. Vikings burning longships was like eagles tearing off their own wings. These were not just ships. They were identity. Every longship represented years of craftsmanship, forests of carefully selected timber, the accumulated knowledge of shipwrights whose skills were passed from father to son across generations. To burn one was to burn a piece of civilization. To burn dozens was to burn the civilization itself. The psychological destruction was as complete as the physical. Scattered bands of Norse survivors found themselves hunted through the Scottish hills by local men who knew every path, every stream crossing, every cave where a fugitive might shelter. These were not professional soldiers. These were farmers and fishermen whose grandparents had suffered Viking raids, whose churches had been burned, whose children had been taken. 20 generations of accumulated rage found its outlet in the October hills above Largs. They showed no mercy because none had been shown to them. The hunters became the hunted. The raiders became the prey. Imagine a single Norse warrior separated from his companions in those October hills. Exhausted, soaked, wounded perhaps, his mailcoat abandoned miles back because it was drowning him in every stream he crossed. Every sound in the fog might be a Scottish patrol. Every farmhouse chimney trailing smoke might be a trap. He has no food, no shelter, and no idea which direction leads to the coast. The mathematics of survival were brutal. For every 10 Norse who scrambled ashore at Largs, perhaps half reached the hills. Of those, how many reached a ship? The hills kept their count, and Scotland was not interested in tallying enemy survivors. Every farmstead was a potential ambush. Every tree line hid archers, and the October weather, having paused briefly, returned on the 4th with renewed fury. Damaged ships that had survived the first storm now faced a second. Weakened hulls patched in haste split open. Rigging repaired with whatever was available failed under fresh winds. The North Sea claimed vessels that Scottish swords could not reach. The mighty invasion fleet that had darkened the horizon just days earlier had become a refugee flotilla, overloaded with survivors, handling poorly in continuing storms. Many ships simply disappeared into the North Atlantic's gray embrace. Some made for Ireland, others limped toward Orkney. Many were never heard from again. Haakon's shattered fleet limped northward in the most humiliating retreat in Viking history. This was not the organized withdrawal of an army that had fought with honor. This was the flight of the defeated, the dying, and the demoralized. The king who had ruled Norway for 46 years could not bring himself to look back at the coastline that had consumed his fleet and his legacy. The arrival at Kirkwall in Orkney should have been a homecoming. Orkney was Norse territory, had been for centuries. Instead, the inhabitants watched in horror as ghost ships limped into harbor. Where was the mighty fleet? Where were the 20,000 warriors? Broken men staggered ashore, speaking of storms that fought for Scotland and beaches that swallowed armies. December 1263 brought the final act. Haakon, the Sea King, the last of the great Viking monarchs, lay dying in the bishop's palace at Kirkwall. Disease, exhaustion, and the weight of catastrophic defeat had broken what no Scottish sword could touch. He had his men read to him from the sagas, the old stories of Viking glory that now seemed to belong to a different world entirely. Stories of Ragnar Lothbrok raiding Paris, of Harald Hardrada conquering Sicily, of longships that crossed oceans and warriors who feared nothing, that walked or swam or flew. The words hung in the air of the bishop's chamber, while outside the Orkney wind blew rain against the stone walls, and the remnants of his fleet rotted in the harbor. The stories were about a world that had ended on a beach in Scotland, while the rain fell and the wind screamed, and his longships burned. His last words to his son Magnus have survived 8 centuries. I should have listened to the wind. Not the dramatic death of a warrior king falling in battle with sword in hand. The slow fading of an old man who had gambled an empire on his pride and lost everything to patience and weather. Magnus succeeded his father as King of Norway. He was called the lawmender, not the warmaker. He understood what his father could not accept. The age of Norse expansion was over. No new fleet would sail for Scotland. No attempt to avenge Largs would come. The Treaty of Perth in 1266 formalized what the storm had decided 3 years earlier. Norway sold the Hebrides and the Isle of Man to Scotland for 4,000 marks of silver, a pittance for 5 centuries of sovereignty, buying what was already won, as Scottish chronicles noted, with barely concealed satisfaction. The negotiation was a formality conducted between 2 parties who both knew the outcome before the first word was spoken. Magnus needed the money. Alexander needed the paper. The treaty's clause about perpetual peace between Scotland and Norway proved prophetic. Never again would longships threaten Scottish coasts. Never again would a Norse king assemble a fleet to reclaim what his ancestors had held. The dragon heads that had haunted the dreams of 20 generations of coastal Scots would never again appear from the morning mist. An existential threat that had defined Scottish life since the 8th century simply stopped existing. The 40 years following Largs became Scotland's golden age. Free from maritime threat for the first time in 5 centuries, the kingdom flourished. Trade expanded. Culture blossomed. The Scottish identity solidified around the understanding that they had ended something ancient and terrible and permanent. For the first time in living memory, a mother on the western coast could watch the October horizon without fear. Alexander III's reign became the standard by which all future Scottish kings were measured. Not for his prowess in battle, which was minimal. Not for the territories he conquered, which were given to him by a treaty he barely had to negotiate, but for his genius in understanding that the greatest military victory is the one where your enemy destroys himself while you watch from dry ground. 2 kings faced each other across Scottish waters in the autumn of 1263. One had 200 longships and 20,000 warriors, and the pride of a civilization that had conquered from Greenland to Constantinople. The other had patience and a calendar, and the knowledge that October in the Firth of Clyde was more dangerous than any army. The one with the ships lost everything. The one with the calendar won an empire. Alexander did not defeat Haakon. He let Haakon defeat himself. The storm was always coming. Every Scottish sailor knew it. Every fisherman's wife who watched the October sky knew it. Alexander simply made sure his enemy would be there to meet it. 500 years of Norse dominion over Scottish waters ended in 96 hours of wind and rain and chaos, on a beach that today hosts a Viking festival where the descendants of the victors celebrate the culture of the defeated. Historical irony does not get more perfect than that. The last great Viking king died whispering about wind. The young Scottish king who destroyed him never drew his sword. And the storm that ended an age did not care about courage or pride or 5 centuries of tradition. It cared about physics, and physics, as the Vikings learned at Largs, does not negotiate.